Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to Late Night Learning. I am your host, Dr. Anthony Palomba. Now, today we're going to be talking a little bit more about ethnographic work, in particular thinking about note-taking and also thinking about a particular study in which people who were watching television were observed. So kind of getting into what an ethnographic study looks like, what to be mindful of when we're taking notes on people, and what it actually may look like out in the field. So let's get started. With note-taking, there are a few things to remember here with ethnographic work. Remember, we're trying to observe people. You may recall earlier in this lecture, I was talking about observing people in an airport or even in a hospital. What's the workflow like in a hospital? Does it work? What is the traffic like in an airport? Do people struggle at certain terminals? So remember, you're trying to record behavior, events, activities, and other features. You want to be able to note things that are pretty simple. You should note what the temperature is, if it's light outside or if you're indoors, what traffic patterns are like. You want to kind of note things that are impacting the setting itself before you start observing other people. The second thing to note is breaking down notes into descriptive information or reflective information. This is going to be going on throughout your ethnographic study because you're all intelligent people. And as intelligent people, we're inclined to reflect. So descriptive information may be looking at Keith and saying, well, Keith is wearing a red shirt. Reflective information may say, oh, that's kind of an interesting shade of red, and it also matches his hat, right? Now we're making a reflective piece of information available in our ethnographic study. So you may be describing what people wear, you may be describing what people are doing, but then you may be reflecting on that action. Just be mindful where you're placing descriptive information and reflective information. My recommendation is to not break down these notes as you're taking them. It's going to make you crazy. If that's what you're observing about Keith, that's what you're observing about Keith. You'll break it down later between descriptive and reflective information. Additionally, be accurate by practicing note-taking in a similar field of observation. If it's possible, before you do an ethnographic study in a Starbucks, go visit another one. Go visit a Dunkin' Donuts. Go visit a coffee shop. Anytime you can have a dry run or a pilot study, if you will, before actually collecting information, it makes you more comfortable and it makes you more confident. Let's keep going. Be descriptive. You don't want to say, for instance, beachgoers at Long Island Beach look content. That means nothing, right? We want to state that they're smiling, they're laughing, they're conversing with each other from their beach chairs. Your ethnographic study, aside from the participants themselves, it's only as good as the kind of note-taking that you employ. The more detailed your notes are, the richer your findings, and the richer the conversation around what you found. There is going to be a lot going on when you're in the field. Just focus on as much as you can on the research problem. If you're looking at how people order coffee on a coffee line, let's say, there might be people coming in on Segways, on skateboards. There might be people with Bluetooths, and they're talking through or on the Bluetooth for that matter. Even though all of this is going on, try to stay as focused as possible on what you're looking at. Be sure to take note of social environment, frequency of human interactions, communication patterns, and describe participants and their roles in the setting as best as you can. And remember, this is going to hinge on whether or not you have interactions with people. And so your note-taking will also be limited surrounding whether or not you have decided to participate in the observation or if you have not. Let's keep moving forward. When you're writing up your results, and I do recommend putting your results or really putting your notes in an Excel spreadsheet. I've done this before. I've labeled columns and rows. It's a really nice way to take notes. I know when we think of Microsoft Excel, we think of numbers, but it really does serve as a really, really wonderful way to take notes and to kind of organize your notes. You want to think about thematic analyses. So if I am doing an ethnography, and if my co-researchers are Sydney and Keith, what may happen is that we may all sit on different sides of, let's say, a mall food court, right? We live about 1/10 of a mile away from Westchester Mall. And so if we're all at the Westchester Mall food court, it makes sense, one, to make sure that your fellow researchers are sitting on different sides of the place itself. Everybody is going to have a different result, right? Sydney might see things that Keith and I haven't. Same thing with Keith versus me and Sydney. And so it works out well if you do this, because then your thematic analyses are stronger. Well, Sydney was sitting on the left side of the food court. Keith was on the right side. I was in the middle. And you know what? From each vantage point, the three of us observed that predominantly women were ordering Chinese food at the food court, or that children all seem to gravitate toward McDonald's, right? These are themes that can be pulled up if you and your fellow researchers have all observed the same pattern. That's key here with thematic analysis. The balance of descriptive or reflective notes is also critical here. Be sure that you're mindful of what is actually description and what is actually reflection, or kind of an idea that you had while you're taking your notes. You want to ensure that themes are valid, and this is why it's really useful to have multiple researchers. You want to be able to consult with other researchers or even participants on the site. If you're going to consult with participants on the site, you got to make sure that you're done with your study, right? It really follows through to have everything together and then to try to reconnect with participants if possible. If you can't do that, it is okay to connect with participants while you're doing the ethnography. But again, remember, you don't want to interrupt people in their behavioral flows. You don't want to interrupt people in their natural setting, so to speak. Let's continue on. This is a study to kind of give you a sense of the power of ethnographic research. And so this was a study that was done in Australia, and it considered everyday domestic settings, interpersonal interactions, and object use that impact advertising broadcasts at home. So it looked at how people consume advertisement. And the name of this study is Everyday Advertising Context, an Ethnography of Advertising Response in the Family Living Room. And so the study considers really how advertising broadcasts interact with and influence behavior in the family living room. So the first research question here included, what are the central elements that activate the process of television advertising response from initial exposure to engagement and consumption? Let's move along. For the second research question here, how do contextualized viewing practices produce domestic advertising means? Exposure to TV advertisement in a domestic viewing space may set in motion shifts in thinking surrounding family identity and future viewed TV ads. Let's move along. Several past studies here looked at how advertisements have influenced people, but they've only kind of isolated the study of advertisements themselves. They really haven't included situational and temporal contexts. So what that means here is that previous literature has looked at how advertisements might affect people, but they haven't really looked at how advertisements might affect people in a living room setting, right? In an organic setting here. But we know that television, which is largely comprised of advertisements, is consumed at home. There's comfort, there are rules. The living room is kind of symbolic in a sense. It's kind of a gathering place. And identity conflicts and obligations with a family can also be unearthed through an ethnography, right? So the authors here elected to look at how advertisements in live time impact families, impact people who are just simply watching television. Let's move along. So the method was, ethnographies were conducted in 8 Australian homes in Glenvale, which was is a suburb outside of Melbourne. Videography. So they recorded behavior at home. They used cameras, they used mics, recorders, and they placed all of this equipment on top of television sets, but the equipment was small, and this is important because it does usually take about 5 to 10 minutes for people to kind of get back into a sense in which they're not being watched. This is a major, major, major issue here because you want to be sure that people know that they can kind of act as they want to be here, right? So it's important in an ethnography to be sure that people kind of get comfortable and can kind of get a relaxed sense within the room or within the observatory or observation place that you might be in. And so it is important to think about small equipment being used to record people, small equipment being used to record behavior, because eventually you kind of want your participants to forget as best as they can that they're not being observed or that there isn't anybody in the room. It's really, really important that you consider this when you're doing any kind of ethnographic work. They recorded quite a bit of information through all of these ethnographies, and it's important to also be mindful of that as well. If you are recording consumer behavior or people kind of in their natural settings, you might be recording thousands of hours or thousands of minutes depending upon what your goals are. Let's go back to that slide. And so you can see here that they recorded over 3,800 minutes, which is the equivalent of just over 63 hours of content. Yes, this is about 2.5 days worth of content, but in order to really cover every parameter across every kind of advertisement, across kind of, again, getting an organic sense of how people might act toward advertisements from their living room, it's important to have this amount of data available for researchers. Let's continue. So some results here. Arrival for advertising spurred social interaction among family members, sometimes incorporating advertisements in discussions. This is known as multimodal communication. So advertisements that were viewed by families spurred conversations, even sometimes about the advertisements themselves. A second finding was labeled as the spatial context, the deterritorialization of advertising in the living room. So there was kind of this loosening of ties between certain consumer practices and their performance from physical locations. Viewers were immersed in the living room, and participants were also in the kitchen as well. And they evaluated what was in their kitchen versus what they just saw in an advertisement. Or they were kind of thinking about some of the advertisements and how it might play into their own lives as well. Finally, the media multitasking context, concurrent media technology use in the living room. In many homes, there were other competing media technologies being played. And so people were on their smartphones, people were reading, people were doing other things as well. And of course, the temporal context, time and advertisement viewing. Advertisements for different products were going on throughout the day. And so sometimes certain advertisements would be responded to more favorably in the morning than at night. This is also kind of important to think about as well. What are people open to or receptive toward throughout the day regarding what kind of advertising messages they may be sent? Let's move along. So, getting back to kind of our note-taking here, it was important to kind of go through a study there because it helped kind of refine this discussion surrounding what we write down and what we take note of. As you can see from that ethnography, they recorded consumer behavior. They recorded when people left the living room. They recorded what people were doing in kitchens. And so hopefully this gives you a better sense of what you can note take as you're moving along. So some considerations when we're observing people. Jottings are brief words or phrases uttered during the observation. So you're not expected to write down full sentences. That would be very difficult to do. You want to be sure that you're getting a description of everything though. A meal, a meeting, a sequence of events. But again, you do not need to write a paragraph. It might be a few words. It might be just a sentence. Analysis of what you've learned in the setting regarding your guiding question. And so you want to be sure that you're focused on what your objective is to learn during the observation itself. You want to reflect on what you learned on a personal nature. What was it like for you to be doing this research? That's important too, especially if you're participating. If you're participating in some sort of class discussion, if you're participating on a vacation, if you're participating in a hotel and you're staying there for a few days and you're interacting with people, but you're a researcher, you want to also reflect about how the experience was for yourself. It's important to note this because how you feel about the experience might also impact your notes. It might also impact your own perception. Yeah, I observed everybody at the Holiday Hilton Hotel, for instance, and everybody seemed to be having a bad time, but frankly, I had a great time. That might color your perceptions about what it's like to be at the hotel. And so some suggestions that have been made in the past include noting the date, time, and place of observation, specific facts, numbers, details of what happened, sensory impressions. You may consider sight, sound, texture, smells, and taste. You may want to also think about personal responses to the fact of recording field notes, specific words, phrases, summaries of conversations, and inside language. If there are certain words that are repeated, certain patterns that you see with language, that's important. Questions about people or behaviors to the site for future investigation, and page numbers to help keep observations in order is useful. Again, if you have a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet, it's kind of easy to go off of your own accord and to really just kind of scroll down as you're taking notes. Let's move along. And so finally, if you've been able to put together that Excel spreadsheet, if you're able to put together this work, there's a lot that can be distilled from it. So uses in industry include many, many different ways in which we use ethnographies. So for one, there's technology use studies, so tablet studies here. So in the past, I've been part of tablet studies at the University of Florida where I did my PhD, in which we observed, this is about 7 years ago, we observed how people were using tablets. It was just kind of a way in which to wrap our minds around how media consumption might be changing from the introduction of tablets. It's also useful for multitasking media consumption. Remember, if your smartphone is being used and if you're engaged in Facebook, Facebook doesn't know that you're also watching The Big Bang Theory or some other show on television, right? All of these devices don't necessarily know what you're doing simultaneously. And ethnography really helps to provide insights here surrounding that. If you're seeking to view consumers in reality, an ethnography is super, super useful here. Because again, you're able to see people in a natural context, in an organic context, and there's less artificiality present while you're doing this. This may include watching people at shopping malls, grocery stores. There is watching people through online shopping. These are known as web ethnographies, in which you actually record people's behavior on a website. And this is also really, really useful if you want to get a sense of how people are going through your website, what impressions they have when they're viewing it, if their eyes might be diverting towards certain features, or even if where their mouse is clicking might be due to certain images or structures or constructs present on the website itself. And so that's all the time we have on Late Night Learning. As always, keep laughing and keep learning.